Well, good morning and welcome to Guarding Data in the Virtual World. My name is Larry Williams. I'm the President and CEO of the Technology Association of Georgia, TAG, and we're delighted to have you here today. First, I really want to thank Verizon as the presenting partner for today's event. Verizon has really created some great insights into cybersecurity. Their report is world-renowned, and we have one of the leaders of that effort every year that will be joining us and talking about it. So Chris Novak, we're delighted to have you here, and I'll introduce you more in a minute. But we're delighted to have a full panel. Roy Hadley of Adams and Reese. He's also the chair of our TAG Cybersecurity, or our InfoSec Society. An expert on that will be moderating the panel today. And our panelists are Vijay, which we can always just call you Vijay, the CEO at Pindrop; John Loveland, the head of global security at Verizon; Kevin Gowen, CISO at Synovus; David Nagel, CISO at Genuine Parts; and David McLeod, the CISO at Cox. So thank you all for joining us. This is going to be a very informative event and very timely. It's an in-depth look at data security challenges facing business in a virtual world. We hope you will learn firsthand the vulnerabilities in security industry experts are warning about, and how you can best protect your data against the breach or fraud. The COVID-19 did not send all of the bad guys at home to work from their basements. They were already there, so they're well versed at this. So I'm looking forward to learning. Before we begin our program, please visit us at tagonline.org and see the upcoming events and opportunities network. We are very active. We've done, about 20 events just this month alone, and month's not over yet. So great ways for you to continue to be engaged. If you're a TAG member, thank you for your membership and leadership in Georgia's technology industry. If you're not a member, please give us a call. We'd love to get you engaged. Now, I'd like to introduce Chris Novak, the Global Director of Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center, to give us an overview of the Data Breach Investigations Report. Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Larry. I really appreciate having the opportunity to be with everybody here today. So wanted to kind of jump right in, if you will, and kind of tell you a little bit about my team, just to kind of touch off on how this report actually comes together each year. So I have responsibility globally over a group called the Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center. And so we perform various types of cybersecurity investigations. In fact, nearly 1,000 every single year, and have been doing so for decades now, and work with customers of all shapes and sizes and industries, private sector, public sector. And over the course of time, one of the biggest challenges that we've seen industry face is understanding how breaches happen, who they happen to, why, and most importantly, what is it that we can learn from those experiences so that we can try to avoid repeating those mistakes, or how can organizations avoid being kind of the next one to be in the headlines. And so over the course of the last 13 years or so, we have been actually publishing this report to do just that. And so we've brought in a variety of external contributors over that time to really enrich that data in order to be able to provide kind of, what we look to be a really good kind of cross-sectional view of how this all plays out. And the idea there is to remove as much of the bias from the data as possible and really stick to kind of an evidence-based approach towards risk management, what we think most organizations ultimately should be doing. And so that's kind of where some of my background comes from. That's kind of a little bit of a background as to how we arrived at the creation of the Data Breach Investigations Report. And obviously we have the brand new one here that I will happily share some key findings and updates from right now, so that folks can kind of see exactly what it is that we've established, what we found, and some of the key important factors from that. So as I dive right in, first thing, I always want to give kind of a nod to our contributors. You see there the 81 contributing organizations that play a role, and they come from pretty much all walks of life, if you will, in terms of other cybersecurity consultancies, cybersecurity product organizations, even law firms, law enforcement, ISACs. Really, everybody, I think, has got some kind of representation in here from either an industry or a geographical perspective. And I think without them, we wouldn't have, a publication like this each year to discuss. And so when we look at the DBIR kind of by the numbers, I really like this slide. We kind of internally call this kind of the worm slide, if you will. And you can see how this kind of paints an interesting representation of some of the big changes that we've seen over the course of the last 5 years. And I'll actually unpack this a little bit more as we proceed through. But I already mentioned 13 years, 81 countries, 81 contributors. The 81 is just coincidental. It's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping. Our team alone typically does, investigations across 100+ countries. So there's a pretty good representation there in the numbers. And the data set continues to be strong year after year. You see the incident number being 157,000+ incidents. And that's actually a 50% increase over what we had in the data set last year. So it's only growing and getting more granular as we move through the period of time. And then you see there the 3,950 data breaches. That almost is a doubling year over year. And I want to caveat that and say these numbers growing doesn't necessarily mean that the landscape has gotten a lot worse, doesn't necessarily mean that the number of breaches has gone up. I think, there's a lot of factors in this, but more representative of the fact that we have more contributors that are each contributing more and better data to the research. And so I wouldn't read necessarily into the numbers growing by, 50 or 100% to necessarily be the takeaway there. But when you look at this slide, some people also call it the twister slide, but when you look at this slide, you kind of see what's ebbed and flowed over the course of the last 5 years. And in particular, you'll notice the drop in things like RAM scraping malware. 5 years ago, it was all the rage across the threat actor community, right? It was number one on the list. And you see there now it's fallen down to the very bottom here in 2020, largely because, I'd love to take credit for it and say, our research has made recommendations and people have heeded those recommendations, whether it's from our report or not, it's anyone's guess. But I do think that's an area that we focused very heavily on over the course of time in terms of how we recommend that organizations make changes to their environments, how industries make changes to the way they secure their data and their assets. And as a result, RAM scrapers almost have no value in the threat actor community anymore because of the fact that there's been a lot that's changed in terms of the control and the security landscape. But you'll also notice phishing, social engineering still remains high on the list. While there is a little bit of a decrease from last year, the reality of it is still strong and prevalent and is a very common way in which we see many threat actors actually getting into a lot of organizational environments. One of the ones that I'll actually particularly spend a little bit more time later unpacking is what you see there on the screen, misdelivery and misconfiguration, particularly as it relates to errors or the human factor. At the end of the day, we see, threat actors want to take the path of least resistance. And, when us humans make mistakes and leave things wide open for the taking, that only makes the threat actor's job that much easier. And so when we look at and unpack misdelivery and misconfiguration, you'll see how that's kind of represented in the numbers. And we'll talk a little bit about why we see those numbers on the rise. So diving into some of the key insights here, some just high-level data points that I think are worth pointing out. In particular, 45% of breaches featuring hacking. And when I refer to hacking, I'm looking at things that are more manual. Think of this as the really, unfortunately, stereotypical kind of hacker thought of, there is somebody hands on keyboard, eyes on glass, actively, manually proceeding through some kind of intrusion vector, lateral movement, exfiltration, but it is not just an automated, scripting and done kind of activity, but there's actually an intellectual person on the other side that's actually proceeding through, that particular criminal activity. You see there's 22% included social attacks. Again, this ties back to the human factor. When you look at almost a quarter of these involving, for lack of a better way of putting it, people on the inside, just letting external actors in. And obviously it's not quite that easy. Typically it's in the form of, phishing attacks. It's someone sends an email in, someone's not paying attention, they give up their credentials, or some other way of socially engineering that access. And I'm not going to speak on all of these here. We'll unpack a little bit more of them as we proceed. The other couple of points though that I did want to mention in particular is on the right-hand side, you see 70% perpetrated by external actors. this continues to be a fairly consistent data point in terms of the majority of these attacks we see coming from outside the organization. And then if you go down kind of just 2 lines there, you'll see the other makeup there, 30% involved internal actors, which in actuality is maybe a little bit more complicated than many people may think, because internal actors are not just insiders in the malicious sense, but sometimes they are internal actors that may have inadvertently or accidentally had done something that led to the organization being breached. And if that's an area of particular interest to folks, I always say that, we should be looking at what organizations are doing from an insider threat perspective. We actually have an entire complementary research report that is just focused on insider threat, and coincidentally it's called our Insider Threat Report. We'll make all this content available to everybody, along with the links to that report if folks are interested in diving a little deeper into the specifics of the insider threat, what that looks like, and what organizations can be doing to address that. But for the purposes of today, I'll just kind of highly touch on that. Some other things that I think are worth mentioning here is when you look at, for example, the discovery timeline. For years, what we found is the majority of breaches took months, many months. In fact, the average up until now has been about 8 months to discover the fact that a breach has occurred. And so you may look at the statistic here on the top left and see 81% of breaches were discovered in days or less. And we may all be wanting to clap and say, hey, fantastic, look at the great job we've done. We've reduced it down from 8 months to days in just 1 year. But the reality of it is the data points actually paint a slightly different and maybe more nuanced picture. And hold on to that thought for a moment. I've got a graph later on that will actually, I think, paint this in a bit more detail and help you understand why it's not quite so simply just 81% discovered in days or less. Another thing that's interesting to point out here is 72% being large business, 28% being small business. A lot of times when I have conversations with CISOs, there's a kind of a challenging element to it in terms of, are we focused more on the large or the small? Who's really the target? Some large organizations will take away that, they only have to worry about very narrow concerns around nation state. They're not going to fall victim to a lot of the simple and more amateur kinds of attacks. More of this is drive-by attacks at small businesses that just don't know better. The reality of it is we actually see that most of this is fairly non-discriminating. A lot of these threat actors are going after just about anybody and everybody that they can hit. And you'll see as we proceed through some of the data points, some of the things that really highlight that is the fact that so much of the breaches that we see are actually opportunistic. And, when my team has the opportunity to actually work, in a coordinated fashion, for example, with law enforcement, we may actually have the opportunity to prosecute some of these criminals, some of these groups. And it's almost surprising to me how often when we work with law enforcement and unpack what it is that the threat actor, had in terms of assets or their technology or any of those kinds of things, what we'll find is that in many cases, the threat actors didn't even necessarily know who they had hacked into. And the best way I could describe it is if someone walked up to you and said, here's $20 from Chris Novak, or here's $20 from John Loveland, or here's $20 from Larry Williams, are you going to care where the $20 came from? It's still $20. And so what we see is in a lot of these opportunistic attacks, the threat actor doesn't necessarily care who the target or the victim is, as long as they can move out the data that they want and as long as it's data that they can easily monetize, which touches on what you also see here as 58% of the victims had personal data compromised. Why? It's one of the most easily monetizable forms of data out there. If you've ever looked at or searched or worked with an entity that explores the deep and dark web, you'll find that that's probably one of the most prevalent forms of data that you can actually go out and purchase. And actually, in a large respect, because of the sheer quantity of it that's out there, the actual cost of it or value of it has dropped dramatically over the years, but it's still a big piece of what the criminal actor groups are going after. And then I'll also just briefly touch on, and we'll get into a little bit more detail later, is that 86% of the breaches being financially motivated, which I think is astonishing. 86% financially motivated. Maybe it is or isn't surprising to others, but I think the interesting element of that is it all comes back to, again, what is it that the criminal actors can just take, steal, and sell? It's all about what they can convert to cash. And for example, you also see a big component of this being breaches that stole user credentials. Why? Because that allows them to gain further access into other things related to that individual. And again, a lot of that tying back to typically it's financials, bank accounts, brokerages, or other forms of access that they may be able to leverage in order to move money or other interesting and valuable assets. So this was the slide that I said that I wanted to get to in terms of the discovery and containment timelines. This is the one where I said we really can't, applaud each other too much in terms of those numbers coming down to days or less, because it's a bit of a misnomer. And here's where we get into a little bit more of the meat of what I meant there. And in particular, if you look at it, there's kind of been, I'd almost say you have kind of two peaks in the graph there in terms of discovery. And when you look at days or less, think about the kind of breaches that we're examining. On one end of the spectrum, you have things like ransomware, where you discover it almost immediately because the threat actor is throwing up a screen that says, if you want access to your system or your data, pay X amount of Bitcoin, and you can potentially decrypt your system and get control of it again. You discover that immediately. Because of the sheer amount of ransomware situations that we saw over the course of the last year, that has artificially, I'd say, driven up the discovery timeframe in days or less to being so high, because so many of them recognize that intrusion, that breach immediately. Now, if you were to actually take that and remove that from the data set and just look at the rest of the data compromise events that we saw, you'll actually find that the picture hasn't improved that much year over year. I'd say it's down a bit from where it was last year in terms of average being 8 months. We're a bit closer to it being about 7 months. And I think there's a couple of big factors that have played into some of those improvements. Obviously, there's still a long way to go. One is MSSPs. Historically, we found that organizations that were leveraging MSSPs, they weren't necessarily discovering and identifying their breaches all that much faster than had they managed their security internally. But what we found is over the course of the last year, many more of the MSSPs have been improving their capabilities, a lot of it being ties into things like threat intelligence, where now they have threat intelligence feeds that are a key component of their MSSP offerings that give them better situational awareness, better optics. So it's not just about what may be odd or unusual or anomalous for this one particular organization, but how do we take in and consider the bigger picture of threat intelligence more broadly, or the organizations themselves may be consuming and leveraging threat intelligence internally and feeding that into some of their MSSP operations that have allowed them to move more quickly on these detection and containment kind of items. But again, I think there's a lot more that we can do, and threat intelligence is always a big thing that I recommend organizations be looking at their maturity and posture. So we look at the active varieties. I touched on this a little bit in the earlier kind of highlight slide. If you look particularly at that graph in the middle, external versus internal, this picture hasn't changed all that dramatically from the very first year. I was mentioning early on that I've been part of the authoring and production of this DBIR since the very beginning, the first one being in 2008. And it's kind of interesting because when we first published this report, there was a lot of people who said, no, the lines are reversed. It's all insider. There's not really that much external. It can't be that high. And over the years, we've brought in more and more contributing organizations. The data has grown, and this picture has not changed. And what this tells us is that, again, consistently, the majority of the actors that we see are external in nature. And I think a lot of it has to do with jurisdictional landscape, the challenge in prosecuting, the fact that you can conduct these attacks and threat actor groups can make off with millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, and do it from across oceans, and do it from places where they may never be prosecuted. So I think there's an element there that contributes to that external piece that I think now the industry has probably recognized and accepted. And these numbers fluctuate, I'd say, plus or minus 10% about, in any given year, just based on, things that are happening. And on the right-hand side here, you see a breakout in terms of, organized crime, nation state. I feel like I've seen this kind of visual so many times that I'm not surprised by where the numbers fall, but I think some folks may look at it and say, oh, nation state's got to be bigger than that. Right now, it's only showing at about 10%. Some years we've seen it as low as, 2 or 3, some years maybe 12 to 13%. But in reality, it hasn't moved all that much. And I think a big piece of this, again, comes back to, while it may be the exciting, dramatic thing to talk about, the thing that we make, TV shows and movies about, the reality of it is the large majority of the breach activity that we see is organized crime. And, I'll touch a little bit on the motivating factors of that. So when we look at organized crime, much like you might think of traditional organized crime, they were almost entirely driven by financial gain. And that is typically the motive that we see here as well in the cyber landscape. So when you look at that graph in the middle, again, this is one where it's ebbed and flowed with slightly bigger swings over the course of the years, but we haven't really seen an inflection point here. We continue to see that financially motivated attacks really lead the way, and espionage continues to be a lower element of that, whether it be nation state or corporate espionage. And what's interesting here is when you look at the financially motivated attacks, most of what we see there, again, tying back to organized crime, most of what we see there is opportunistic in nature. And I tell people this because, kind of referring back to the earlier slide where I said we see that a lot of these threat actors are fairly non-discriminating in that they go after organizations of all shapes and sizes and all geographies because they're just looking for what they can steal and sell. When we look at the way that they typically go about their business, when we've had the opportunity to, say, work with law enforcement and actually get access to the threat actor's own assets for review and interrogation, what we find is they have built up these long victim lists. And typically, they kind of almost work, I'd say, much like an assembly line, where they'll have part of their operation that will really focus on identifying new victims. And typically, the way that they go about doing that is they just scan the internet all day long, every day. And in fact, one of the things I tell people is, if you're not doing vulnerability scanning and pen testing, I can guarantee you that somebody else is. They're probably just not sharing the results and the reports with you. So it's an invaluable thing to be considering and doing. But what we see is they build these victims lists just based on the scanning, and then they pass that list off to someone else whose job it is to say, okay, what are all the exploit kits that we have that line up with these potential victims? And they just target all those. And then once they've got in, they hand it off to someone else whose job is pivot around the organization, find the interesting data, exfiltrate out to a command and control or a repository, move on to the next one. In fact, in a lot of these situations, some of these organized crime groups have their hands in so many victims simultaneously, they don't even realize or care sometimes when they get cut off. Because as long as the data is streaming in fast enough to fund what they want, they expect that they're going to get kicked out at some point when things get discovered. And to them, it's just a matter of, hey, every time we get kicked out, we better make sure we've got our foot in the door somewhere else or in 2 more or 3 more places. And so that's a big driving factor of what we see on the financially motivated side. You'll also notice in here, there's a secondary aspect here, and I just wanted to point that out. Those are situations where the threat actor is maybe not necessarily specifically having a motivational aspect as it relates to who they're targeting. So they target entity X, not because they necessarily want to get into entity X for financial or espionage gain, but because they want to use entity X as a stepping stone into what actually is their target, is some other organization, and that may be for financial or espionage motivated reasons. I'm only going to touch on this lightly, and then I've kind of got like a breakout slide in the next one here. And the thing that I really wanted to be the takeaway from this, and I put that red arrow on the right-hand side to really call attention to the errors. We see ebbs and flows of things like hacking and social engineering, malware, misuse, physical, all these other types of threat actions. But one that really kind of stood out as interesting to me was when you look at errors, and these are human errors, if you look at that over time, that has steadily increased across the chart and continues to do so. And when I break that out into what those errors actually are, you see in this chart here, there's 3 particular things that really stand out. In blue, you have misconfiguration. In orange, you have misdelivery, and in green, you have publishing errors. And in particular, you look at misconfiguration, the giant kind of hockey stick that took over the course of the last year's time. What do we see there? And when we dive deep into what that actually represents, what we actually found is a variety of things that make it up, but really some of the big things that really top the charts are organizations struggling with proper security, configuration, and management of things like cloud-based services or as a service kind of capabilities, where they may be doing infrastructure, platform, or software as a service, and I want to stress, not that any of those technologies are inherently insecure, but the challenge we see a lot of organizations facing with them is they have a rock star IT and security team that has been doing this for 20 years, say. And then suddenly the organization says, okay, we're now going to take this and move it all to AWS or Azure or Google or Oracle or whatever their provider of choice may be. And in a lot of those cases, the expertise, experience, and knowledge doesn't necessarily translate one-to-one. How you configure this in one environment is not how you secure an S3 bucket in AWS, for example. And so we'll see a lot of misconfigurations in places like that that have ultimately led to data being exposed. Similarly with, misdelivery or publishing error, you make something available, for example, a report on your website that you intend for all the world to read. You hope they do. But then you later find out, oops, the directory that report was in, we actually made the whole directory available. And now everything in there is world readable, and maybe it was not intended to ever all be public. So kind of a handful of examples of some things that we see that are typically tracking back to kind of the human error aspect. And interestingly enough, you look at the right-hand side here, you see the breakout of how those errors are discovered. And this may shock folks. Honestly, it surprised me a bit that you see there about 50%, almost half of everything here you see in the human error side of things was actually discovered by external security researchers, or maybe as part of a bug bounty type program. The reality of it is the organizations themselves, if you kind of look down that chart, it doesn't get to reported by employee in an internal perspective until well on the list, and you're looking at less than 10%. You see unrelated third parties, even customers. This is always one that's interesting when people call our rapid response retainer hotline saying, hey, we believe we've got an incident. The first thing we ask them is, well, what do you know? How did you find out? And we'll oftentimes hear either it was someone through a bug bounty found something, and then we find others are exploiting it, or they found that their customers went and just simply Googled for themselves on the internet to see what they'd find, and all of a sudden they found all sorts of private or confidential information that should have never been available on the internet, but yet it was. And so now they need help in investigating to figure out, what the impacts of it were. Was it just isolated to those handful of things that they found, or might it actually be something significantly larger? Here's kind of an interesting view on the landscape, in particular, looking at the unbroken chains and path-based attacks. These two charts are almost identical, and the real key takeaway here is when we look at the breach landscape, what we find is some of the things that we've probably been preaching or hearing preached to us over the years is right on rock solid true. Defense in depth, security in layers actually works. And when we look at this, what these graphs represent is if you look at the breaches or the incidents and you look at the sheer quantity of those events and the number of actual steps that it took to actually compromise those entities, you'll find that the majority of all the incidents and breaches took less than 10 steps. In many cases, took almost less than 5 in order for them to be successful. And what that means is, I mentioned earlier, the human aspect of the threat actor. They often want to take the path of least resistance. They're looking for a lot of opportunistic attacks. So when you look at this data, it tells us that the more speed bumps, roadblocks, segmentation, things like that we can throw up in the way of the threat actor, the more inclined they are to move on. Think about it. If they can spend, or if they have to spend a month pounding away at one organization because it takes 45 layers to get through, and maybe 45 is an exaggeration, but if they have to spend a month or 2 months trying to get in, only to steal 100,000 credit card records, versus they could say, you know what? I can go to the next IP address on my list and compromise that in a matter of seconds or minutes and make off with just about the same amount of data. Or maybe I have to compromise 10. The reality of it is they're probably going to do it much faster than that 30 or 60 days it took to get into these organizations that have many more layers, many more steps, or more of a defense in-depth strategy. So it's important that we really kind of reiterate that and say, hey, we need to look for areas where we may have our assets close to the perimeter, and what is it that we can be doing to add that layered security in place to ensure that we're adding enough steps in the way of what a threat actor might be going after, such that maybe they're moving on to other targets, and they're not necessarily coming after us. And this is another view on that. I actually kind of like this slide for a lot of reasons. But when you look at this in particular, if you look at the right-hand side, you see the different actions kind of color-coded there by error, malware, physical, unknown, hacking, misuse, social. And what this represents is, if you look at the totality of the events for which we can identify the full path of the attack and all the steps that it took to actually be successful, you can see along the bottom the number of steps. So on the right-hand side is basically they hit their intended target in a matter of 1 or 2 steps, right? And you see the majority of those lines are hitting close to the right-hand side. As this picture elongates to the left, you see that it takes more and more steps. So there's only a handful that really went out to the 20 or 30 step mark. And what's also interesting is the colors represent what actions they took at what step or stage in their attack. So they may have started, for example, with social engineering, a lot of those yellow lines you see, or maybe a little bit orangish lines. And then after they conducted the social engineering attack, they used hacking actions to further pivot within the environment, and then may have used malware to then handle the exfiltration of the data. And so the color-coded elements of this indicate what types of actions they took at what stage of the attack they were in. And you'll also notice that there's 3 horizontal axes here, because it also represents what the intended target or motivation or aspect of the attack was. For example, was the threat actor ultimately targeting the availability, confidentiality, or integrity of their intended target asset? So there's a lot to unpack there. And, I would definitely encourage folks, if you have the time, to check out this specific section of the report, because we go into some pretty good and deep discussion there. And then just kind of wrapping things up here, we get asked a lot of questions, especially in the face of COVID-19, in terms of, recommendations around work from home strategy. And I know that there's a panel discussion on this afterwards, so I don't want to dig too deeply in this, but, we'll also make all this available to everybody. There's some recommendations there on the left-hand side of the screen in terms of things that we feel organizations and individuals can do in order to ensure that they have, the safest and securest possible work from home environment, as well as some links to other resources that we found to be valuable. And I get a lot of questions from entities about, what it is that they should be considering or maybe reconsidering kind of in this new age in which we live right now. And the 3 things at the bottom are the ones that I keep coming back to is, what is it that they're doing from a response standpoint? If you believe you had a great strategy for handling an incident response before, does that strategy contemplate the new world in which we live? The fact that your SOC and your NOC personnel may no longer be able to be in the same room. Collaboration is a lot harder. How do you actually access and collect evidence in the face of an incident to actually be able to move through that incident response effort in a timely fashion and still be able to mitigate those? Because while there may be a lot of things that are different in the world today, and a lot of businesses may be operating in a more limited capacity, the reality of it is, if you're open, or if you're planning to open or working through a reopening strategy, the response plan that you probably had for an incident or a compromise 6 months ago may not necessarily work successfully for an incident that happens today. And also, I mentioned earlier, in terms of some of the improvements in the timelines, a lot of that being attributed to what we see organizations improving in their threat intelligence capabilities or aligning with MSSPs that have a very good integration with threat intelligence, so that they get that bigger, better situational awareness, especially of what we've seen lately. There's a lot of COVID-19 related scams, attacks, and so on. The more organizations can be plugged into what that landscape looks like, especially as it relates to them with dealing with the challenge of a larger work from home workforce, that becomes more critical. And then the last thing that I just wanted to mention was dark web hunting, because there's a lot that organizations can be doing, even if they're not in the office, even if they're not in their NOCs or SOCs or in their fusion centers, that they can be doing to do research on the deep and dark web to see if there are things that, hey, do we see data of ours already for sale? Is there something we can do to proactively dive into that deeper and see whether or not that may be indicative of an incident that we need to work to contain? And obviously, if those are areas where organizations don't have the in-house expertise, there's lots of ways that they can get that from external third parties, whether it's of Verizon or other places. So I'd encourage folks definitely look at what they're doing in and around those areas. And with that, I think we'll give it back to Larry. I don't know if there's any kind of Q&A you planned or how you want to handle things from here.
Into our panel. And so at this point, we'll turn it over to Roy Hadley. Roy Hadley, again, is a great leader, a great expert in cybersecurity. And so, Roy, let me pass it to you.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it. Chris, we are very thankful for that report. Lots of great information in it. The Verizon report is one of those reports that, I anticipate looking forward to every year because it really is a great summary of what's happening out there in the real world with respect to cybersecurity, attacks, breaches, those sorts of things. So again, Chris and Verizon, thank you. Again, I'm Roy Hadley. I am the chair of the Information Security Society for TAG. That's my night job, my day job. I am also a lawyer at the law firm of Adams and Reese, where I am a member of the Privacy, Cybersecurity, and Data Management team. We listened to Chris and we heard all the information that he put forth that was contained in the Verizon report. But the reality is we are in a new era right now. We're in a new normal and nobody knows really what that new normal is. Nobody knows how we're going to navigate it, when we're going to come out on the other end, and what it looks like. And that is particularly of concern in the cybersecurity world. We are always looking for how can we secure our networks, how can we train our people, all those sorts of things. And today we're going to talk about that. We have a great panel, 5 experts that are going to share their wisdom of how do we navigate in this new normal. First, we have Vijay, and Larry didn't do it, but I'm going to try Balasubramaniyan, who is the CEO of Pindrop. We also have John Loveland, who is the global head of security for Verizon. We have Kevin Gowen, who is the chief information officer for Synovus. David McLeod, who is vice president and chief information security officer for Cox Enterprises. And we have, surely not last and definitely not least, David Nagel, chief information security officer for Genuine Parts. And so we are going to ask everybody to refresh your browsers. So just hit the refresh button on your browsers. I think there's some technical thing that will pop up and just do that. Refresh your browsers and you'll be good to go. So we're going to now pivot to our panel and talk about these things that we heard in the Verizon report, but also go to, kind of what's happening right now. And so I'm going to ask the first question, and I'll preface all of this by saying, since we have 2 Davids today, I'm going to say David, or just call you Mr. McLeod and Mr. Nagel. Everybody else I'll call by their first names. So, Mr. McLeod, just to start with you, this COVID-19 crisis has driven people to remote workforces, and I'm sure you at Cox have experienced that. You've put people remotely, you've put your networks, kind of spread them out because of this new remote workforce. Question for you. What has struck you the most about where we are today, this remote workforce, and what that looks like for your company?
Become hacker heyday. The reason it's hacker heyday, to the point in the DBIR, people. When people are distracted, when people are stressed, they make a lot more errors. So my ability to see the phishing email, to think more comprehensively about how did I log in, was that a real pop-up screen? I'm just going to miss it. So bottom line, hacker heyday, because I'm distracted and I'm stressed out. And that's what we got to work on differently.
Mr. Nagel, what has been your biggest challenge at Genuine Parts with respect to how your remote workforce is operating from a security standpoint, from a workforce standpoint? What has been your biggest challenge?
I would say our biggest challenge is just the timing. Moving so quickly to go from an environment that was predominantly office-based or store and distribution center-based to remote that timing moved a lot of areas of weakness that were manageable, but it just required us to communicate more with different components of our business that we wouldn't on a consistent basis, be it HR or service desk, just to make sure that the business could still go. And even if we had to work in parallel to keep the business moving to protect them, that adjusted how our operations worked from a cybersecurity perspective.
And that's interesting. You know, one of the things I know with Genuine Parts is you have a very big supply chain, and you have your work at home force, but you also have to integrate with your supply chain. Have there been any challenges with respect to that in the current COVID crisis?
It's a great question. Our third-party risk program, our third-party risk team has been very busy just to make sure that those third parties that we do interact with files and payments and suppliers that provide the parts that we move, it's actually required us to work more closely with them. And the nice thing about it is because of the family-oriented culture of our company, they've been more than willing to do that. So it has required more interaction on a more consistent basis and more communication, which we as a security team probably wouldn't do unless we did have the COVID situation.
Do you ever think we'll go back to the new normal? And that's a question for everybody, but I'll pop it to you, Vijay, just to get your thoughts on it. Given where we are, and I was reading an article this morning that said Facebook, for example, was over the next 10 years going to transition probably half of its workforce to remote working, kind of piggybacking on where they are now and just really making that transition. Do you see that as something that most companies are going to be doing? And I'll ask you, Vijay, and then John, if you could follow up and give us your thoughts also.
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting thing is, all of us measure productivity. And if you actually look at the work from home productivity metrics just across the board at Pindrop, they've increased, right? So we've seen, for example, the speed at which we're generating features on the engineering side has increased. The speed at which we're, reducing, responding to our customers in terms of customer support requests has actually decreased by 50%. So, people are, focused at their homes. And so, we're definitely seeing productivity increases just across the board. The question is, how consistent is that productivity increase over a longer term? And the areas that most organizations are trying to crack fall in three categories, right? One, it is collaboration, right? When you're dealing with your team and you're getting on your regular Zoom call to find out what's the update, that's one thing. But how do you do cross-functional collaboration? And is your organization moving to a more siloed culture as a result of you not creating that cross-functional collaboration? Because if anyone on this call will tell you you're in back-to-back Zoom or WebEx or whatever your conferencing system of choice, right? You're in back-to-back meetings. So you're not stopping and thinking about, am I collaborating, right? Whereas when you were in physical offices, you just walk across, to someone's cubicle and have a conversation. The second area is innovation, right? And as a startup, this is really important for us. How do you keep innovating? Not just because you want to keep up with the latest and greatest, but because the fraudsters are constantly innovating. So that's the second part of it. And then the third part of it is the serendipity that happens when you're in physical spaces. So how do you make sure you have enough of those opportunities to be serendipitous in conversations, and all of this leads to cultural changes as well as agility changes. And so I think, one of the things that a lot of organizations, including ourselves, are trying to figure out is in this new normal, and most people are not going to go back to 100% back into physical locations. That's my prediction. You're going to have some combination of work from home and some combination of physical presence. But if that's true, how do you make sure these three things stay consistent over the longer term? And that's going to be the challenge. And that's the challenge we're trying to solve for as well.
That's some great insight there. John, what are you thinking in your seat at Verizon? Do you think we'll ever go back to where we were? And is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Vijay said. I don't think we go back to a fully office-based environment. In fact, I think if I was in commercial real estate right now, I'd be concerned because I think the commercial real estate market changes dramatically as a result of this. We're going to see a lot more hoteling, if you will, and we're already preparing for that at Verizon, so that when we look to go back to work in the fall, probably at the earliest, it's going to be on a very limited basis, and we will have probably no assigned offices. It's going to all be hotel based. And look, from my perspective, it's a good thing. I think that there's a happy medium here, not only in terms of increasing productivity, as Vijay alluded to, but really just the overall sort of environmental sustainability of it, right? I think that there is I tend to be an optimist, and so I look for the bright linings or the silver linings in events like this. And I think that, look, this is from a productivity perspective and an overall environmental sustainability perspective, I think it's a good thing to have more of a balance between remote work and office work. I think that's as long as we can address some of the concerns around, how do we, to Vijay's point, continue and maintain the innovation. I think it's a net positive for us. But one thing's for sure, and one thing that this crisis pointed out for us, none of us really know exactly what's going to happen. So I think we've got a lot to learn, and these next 6 to 8 months as we start to emerge into a new normal, it's going to be very interesting.
Absolutely. So I'm going to pivot here to Kevin here for a second. In the when Chris talked in the DBIR, one of the big things was that he said most of these attacks are financially motivated. So in the financial services industry, are you seeing an increase in attacks and attack vectors given the remote workplace and where we are with the COVID situation, or is it kind of business as usual, the same?
Yeah, for the most part, what we're seeing are the same types of things, similar volumes, similar types of attacks. But what we're not seeing, what we are seeing is consistent volume and people taking advantage of COVID-19 as a theme. So phishing still looks the same in terms of overall volume. We're just seeing a lot more COVID-19 themed attacks. In terms of people trying to commit financial crimes and exploit us, we're seeing a few unique things that popped up. There's a really large attack going on that's exploiting state unemployment agencies to the tunes of 9 figures to this point. So that's kind of unique to this. But other than that, it's a lot more of the same. Just people trying to be opportunistic. It's a phrase we've heard a lot this morning. Using the distractions, the things going on with COVID, some of the unique programs that are going on, particularly the target businesses and retail customers, to use that as their approach and then to carry on the same types of attacks they typically do.
Fantastic. So, one of the things that you read about in the news, and we're not going to get political here, just epidemiologists will say that, you typically you have these things coming in waves and spikes and those sorts of things. I know a lot of organizations, my law firm included, transition to a work from home environment, then is now transitioning back to, kind of being back in the office and supporting customers and clients from the office. Kevin, I'm going to stay with you for a second. What lessons learned from what it took to get your workforce where it was remote should people be thinking about if this, COVID thing spikes again, or if something else comes up and people have to rapidly transition? What lessons have you learned from the current incident?
One key takeaway for us was we were able to really quickly move a whole lot more people remote than we ever expected we could. In the course of less than 2 weeks, we had 80% of our company working remotely. So that was a pleasant surprise. What we learned out of that, so one of our big takeaways though, is banking has a lot of legacy paper-based processes. And we built plans that we executed on really quickly and got people out, but in a sustained long-term event like this, where people are gone for a while, we realized there are processes that just break or are very difficult to sustain. So that was one big learning. The other is just basic blocking and tackling. We focused on getting people out. We didn't think about the fact that on my desk I have 2 large monitors and we sent you home with a laptop. That was going to be fine for 3 days. If you're going to be gone for 3 months, we need to think about if we send people back because there's an increased outbreak, we need to make sure we pack up all of the things they need to be productive for the long term, because you really don't know how long you might be out if you have to go back.
David, at Cox, what about with you? I know you have a large workforce, and maybe some of that workforce was remote anyway. But what happened at Cox, lessons learned wise, that you could share with our audience?
Yeah, so we were very fortunate to move 6,000 people off the Atlanta campus into home in about a 48, 72-hour period. The biggest learnings were about user experience. Totally agree with all the points made so far, but here's a couple of little things. Well, guess right. You don't have your chair. That's a thing. Did you have a home situation? That's a thing. But specifically cybersecurity technology, that password reset that comes up every 90 days, how painful is that all of a sudden? Were they enrolled in the self-service option? Do they have to be connected to the VPN to do it? So we found out that those normal, good to protect the company security measures were ornery, mistimed. So we had to pull back and say, how do we help them through this experience? Where do we relax or delay some security controls, specifically with password management, so that they can still do their jobs? Because after all, they're stressed out enough. Now they can't get logged in. They expired the password. So user experience has bubbled up, and that was our main focus in the first 10, 12 days. Make it easy to stay secure.
Okay, fantastic. I appreciate that. I'm going to stop here for a second and just remind our listening audience, if you have Q&A, use the Q&A feature. Also, if you have questions for Chris Novak with the Verizon report, let us know those also, because he will come back on the line with us to answer any questions that you may have about the DBIR. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that Vijay at Pindrop, they have a report out also that can be downloaded on their site on kind of risk associated with people and processes and things like that, particularly with voice applications. So I'm going to use that as a segue, make my own segue here, and say when we talk about people risk, that's always going to be a risk for anybody. Vijay, what are you seeing? Are you seeing increased risk, people risk, because of this remote workforce? And I'm going to come back to the panel and ask, what have you done from a cybersecurity standpoint for this remote workforce in terms of helping people beef up their home networks, those sorts of things? But before we go to that, Vijay, what are you seeing from a people standpoint with respect to COVID and the risk in the cyber community?
No, absolutely. So, we specialize in, voice authentication and voice security. And so a lot of people that we service are call centers and call center agents. And one of the craziest things that happened when, everyone had to work from home is a lot of the call center agents who had to, traditionally work in offices now are all part of remote workforce. And it was crazy, right? We saw, in phase one of this pandemic, a 100% increase in call volume. Then it jumped to 200%. Then it jumped to 600%. And by the time the government stimulus hit, it jumped to 1,000%. So not only did you have to have a remote workforce, you had to start hiring people to handle the additional calls and put in seats and train call center agents and all of that in a remote workforce environment. And here's the crazy thing, right? When you have all of these people in these remote workforces, when you had physical locations, you had security mechanisms that allowed for certain things. So for example, in the call center agent, you're not allowed to get your phone when you're actually taking calls. And especially if you're taking calls about high net worth individuals, you can't have your phone along with you. And there's there's an incident from a couple of years back where, Pindrop, generates alerts when anytime a fraud call comes in. And we found that there was this particular agent who was getting 25% of all of the fraud activity in a week just coming to them. And we were like, that's strange, right? It should be well distributed across all agents. And then we found out, and what the customer did is they placed a recording device in the call center floor, and they found out that immediately after that person had done a wire transfer, they picked up their cell phone and said, "Hey, big dog, I just finished your wire transfer." So they were actually colluding with the malicious attacker, and they figured that out because they were in a physical location. You can't do that anymore, right? You can't figure out who's, the fact that they're not using their cell phone, who's looking behind them, right? Now that they have access to all of the data, if they want to pull up some high net worth individual's account, they can do it, and someone behind them can actually instruct them what they want to do. Are they really the ones working? Is it some other call center agent who's actually handling the calls? So there's all of these issues in terms of authentication, identity, and things like that, and data security in particular, that now organizations have to deal with, because previously you had a physical perimeter, and now that physical perimeter is completely gone away, and you have to learn all of this in an accelerated fashion and hire new people. That's creating a lot of challenges. And what we're seeing is, one, they're having to struggle with data security. They're having to struggle with how much insider threat is going to jump up, and they're having to struggle with how do you get this new workforce to be aware that they're not getting socially engineered in the confines of their home, where they're distracted, right? Kids are running around in the background. They're not as mindful that they're potentially getting phished or wished. And so those are the challenges that a lot of organizations that we deal with are having to face and having to realize in a very quick fashion.
Thank you. David, at Genuine Parts, what from a people standpoint, from a workforce standpoint, were some of the issues that you saw and had to deal with from a security standpoint, from a productivity standpoint? I know David at Cox said, he not struggled, that's my word, but had issues around, kind of processes and what people were doing. And I know the setup at home, the physical setup, you've got 2 screens at work and you've got a laptop at home. What are some of the challenges that you ran into at Cox, and what were some of those, Genuine Parts, and what were some of those solutions?
Yeah, no, I think David did a great job of capturing, how security can enable, right? We provide the appropriate security, but we do have to relax a little bit when in times of circumstance like this. I say there's 2 things that we learned as a part of our people risk process, and one was we need to train differently. I think sending out informers and emails, we would see them be received and we would see people read them, but it didn't really have the impact. So we had to garner more support at the local level to communicate differently. And a lot of that came from partnerships that we hadn't had in the past, such as with a stronger partnership with HR and our infrastructure and applications teams, so that, the dependent upon the user and their role, the communication and the awareness shifted a little bit. If it's an administrator who needs remote desktop protocol access, then we would take that and obviously say that makes sense. If it's somebody in a store that looks at shelves and fulfills orders at an Apple store, they probably don't need remote desktop protocol access. So that partnership with infrastructure and HR and applications really helped us to prioritize and ensure that we enabled the business given the pandemic, as opposed to just saying no to everything.
Gotcha. Great insight there. I'm going to pivot just a little bit here. One of the things that I've read about, heard about, seen with clients in my day job is the sophistication of attacks, sophistication increasing. You're starting to see more social engineering. You're starting to see more sophisticated business email compromise. So, John, I'm going to turn to you and just ask, kind of what are you seeing? Are these attacks getting more sophisticated? Is it my imagination? Kind of what are you seeing out there with clients right now and with your organization?
Yeah, no, it's certainly not your imagination. And I would echo an early comment from David McLeod. It is a hacker heyday. and what we're seeing is increasing call it specificity or targeting around phishing emails in particular, right? So, right after the COVID crisis, first really started to ramp up into gear in early March, we saw a proliferation of emails that promised more information about COVID infections in your neighborhood, right? Or promised information about the PPP program, or information about, restaurants and things like that in your neighborhood where you could, where there's special deals. So we saw a very targeted campaign, if you will, that was playing on the fears and concerns and really thirst for information that people have about the COVID crisis. And it just goes to, kind of the broader theme here that I know that we see every year in our in the data breach investigations report, is that hackers are going to use the best methods and best tactics available to them to get your attention, to get you to click on an email, to exploit vulnerabilities. They're going to go where the low-hanging fruit is, and right now the low-hanging fruit is playing on people's fears and concerns about the coronavirus. So we saw a significant uptick in phishing emails around that, and then we expect to see we haven't really started digging into the data yet. The data is still, as you can imagine, coming at us in spades right now, but we expect to see an increase in click-throughs, right? I mean, it's you've got people at home. I think Vijay was making this point. You've got people at home that they don't necessarily have sort of the same security consciousness when they're in their office or in their sitting at their kitchen table that they may have when they're in their office. They have just like all of us, concerns about what's happening. They have a desire for information, and so we expect to see an increase in click-throughs in our next report next year related to this. So it's a real concern, and we believe that because of sort of the lack of potentially security hygiene that has accompanied the work from home movement, as well as the fears and concerns that folks have about what's happening, we certainly expect to see an increase in hacking as a result of that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I'm glad that it's not my imagination. Kevin, I'm going to switch to you real quick, especially coming from the financial services industry. Ransomware still is a big problem. I was involved with the city of Atlanta in helping it respond and recover from its ransomware attack in 2018, which was probably the largest attack against a municipality at that time. And you still see ransomware attacks out there. You still see them becoming more sophisticated. Is ransomware a concern for your industry, Kevin? And are you seeing more sophisticated attacks? I know data is being stolen now and held for ransom. Kind of piggybacking on the DBIR, the data breach report, these things are financially motivated. What are you seeing? What are you concerned about out there right now with respect to ransomware attacks?
Yeah, we're always concerned about that, right? That's a big risk for everybody. It's kind of an event that if it hits you, it's going to be, a life changer, maybe a career changer for the CISO. So yeah, we're worried about that. But the thing that we find ourselves focusing on more, I mean, that's basic blocking and tackling, protecting against that, and focused on phishing and endpoint controls and things like that. But rather as much on ransomware kind of attacks, which you're just looking at how can they get money from us. People are looking to get in, take information, take over customer accounts, either to monetize our information or to take over customer accounts and use that as part of how they're cashing out and monetizing their attacks. That's something that's really grown. The effort people are going to either get our data or to get our customers' credentials and then take over legitimate accounts and either take their money or use that as a way to move funds around is something that's significantly grown. In fact, I mentioned the state unemployment benefits thing that's going on now from a fraud perspective. The angle we see is they're getting legitimate customers to participate as money mules and helping them cash out on those things. So that's what we're seeing. My big concern is them taking our data, our customers' data, and then using that to create a lot of money rather than just trying to commit a ransomware event against us to get kind of funds in that one-time attack.
Wow, fantastic. David, at Cox, I know Cox has a lot of businesses, some with very sensitive information. What are you seeing and what are you concerned about right now in the ecosystem that we call cybersecurity?
So we started the year with more concerns around ransomware, because after all, you don't actually have to break in and take data in order to get, a nice payout. So we saw a lot of noise in that aspect. And now that we're at home, we wonder, we're trying to test some brand new hypotheses to say, how would they come at us now? Would they have to knock down all of our folks working from home for a day or a week in order to, try to extort us? So beyond that, we're moving into phase 2 of concerns, which is going to be around furloughed people, right? Many of our businesses had folks take a break from work for a while. I'm going to call it that. And now they got to come back. Well, guess what? That's called onboard of accounts and offboard of accounts. So any smooth run process that takes too much volume in a short period of time could expose some weaknesses. So now we're making sure that we just do a really good job of helping the employees that are coming and going from work as the business recovers and those business units pivot. So new processes under high volume, got to be careful, got to be really diligent there.
And I'm going to stay with you here for a second, David. You mentioned furloughed employees. What about employees that are terminated? Some jobs are being eliminated. And, what's the concern, especially since a lot of these employees that are being eliminated are remote? Are there any concerns that you're thinking about or dealing with respect to that, to employees that are being unfortunately terminated because of business activities?
Right. So we don't have any significant concerns. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. But we are paying very close attention to the account terminations and the how. Because here's what's different. Because of what the whole country is going through at this time, we don't terminate the same way, right? Before COVID, when your last day was Friday, that was it. Well, today, when terminations happen, there's a continuation of benefits. There's a continuation of medical. So now I have associates who still need some access to data, not all access. I can't just fully cut them off. So point being, brand new process for partially exited employees that need some account access, but not all. Again, new process, done in high volume, short period of time. We got to be really careful and follow up to make sure those all work.
Great thoughts there. Because again, the workforce is just changing. Again, whether it's furloughs, whether it's terminations, going home, coming back to the office, all of those things are always, anytime you have movement, let's just call it, you have vulnerability. So great information. Vijay, I'm going to turn to you real quick here. I know we just talked about ransomware. What else are you seeing out there that's becoming more sophisticated in terms of attack vectors, phishing, anything like that? What are you seeing and what are you concerned about?
So there's a couple of things that I'll talk about, right? So I think early on when we were talking about the DBIR report, we talked about the fact that these attackers are constantly trying to mine for information because that's the first phase of the entire attack. And one of the things that we're seeing very interestingly is that right now most organizations have self-service channels. So for example, if when you first call a bank or an insurance or a retailer, you get an automated system that interacts with you for a significant portion of the conversation before it hands you over to an agent, only if you don't get what you need, right? And so that automated system, what's happening is we're finding massive bots attacking those automated systems. So it's machines against machines trying to glean information, right? Because what I can do is I can spoof all the phone numbers of a particular set of customers and then call these self-service channels. And what ends up happening when you call the self-service channel with, let's say, my phone number, is it tells you my account balance, or it asks for some basic information and then gives you details about the last 3 transactions that I performed. Now, as soon as they have that information, they can go to the customer, send them an SMS message and say, hey, I'm your bank calling. We've seen this $10,000 charge on your account. And just to tell you that it's really the bank, here is your account balance. Here are your last 3 transactions. You log in online and it's exactly right. And so the IVR is becoming the new gas station. Before fraudsters, what they used to do is when they used to get a live card, they would go to the gas station, do a small little charge just to make sure that card was valid and had money on it. They're using these self-service channels because no one is looking to start getting globs of information on who banks with where, who has insurance accounts with where, and so on and so forth. So they're creating a better profile of, let's say, Vijay, who does he bank with? Where does he have his life insurance? Who does he shop with? All of that to then send me a message to then get me, involved in a social engineering attack because I think it's my bank. And they're going even further, right? Like they're connecting me and the bank and staying in the middle of a call, trying to glean more and more of this information. So there's sophistication there. We're also seeing sophistication on the kinds of technology that they're using. So against, the CEOs and the CFOs, we talked about business email compromise early on. The business email compromise is, largely on email, right? So we're seeing that business email compromise start going over voice channels. So imagine you get a call, you're the CFO or you're the accounts payable division of your organization. You're getting a call from your CEO saying, hey, you know what? I'm getting on this plane. There's this really important merger that I need to get done. Because I'm on the plane, I can't call you back. I need to wire $17 million, or I have to go take care of my old, relative. So I'm going to be busy for a while. So I need to wire $17 million because I need to get this merger done in this crazy time. And, they're actually faking or synthesizing the voice of the CEO. And how they're doing it is they're actually doing it through audio breaches. So we've talked a lot about data breaches. They're actually mining your intranets for any audio addresses that your CEO has had, using that to create a synthesized version of your CEO's voice, and then using that to fool you. Because think about it, right? When you had an email that came to you that said, this was your CEO, you could check the email headers. That's what a lot of our awareness does, right? Check the email header. Does it really look like it's coming from Cox, or does it really look like it's coming from Pindrop? But in this case, you're hearing your CEO's voice saying, I need you to do this now. So the level of attacks have definitely gone up. And as I mentioned, you're distracted. Sometimes you believe it. We've seen as high as a $17 million wire leave an organization as a result of an attack like this.
So what you're telling us is that everybody on this webinar ought to be concerned because somebody can be recording our voices right now.
Absolutely. We're talking about data breaches with all your Alexas and your smart devices in your houses. We're on the brink of our first audio breach. And, hopefully Verizon has a audio breach section in their data breach. Actually, maybe not hopefully, right? Like, I don't want that to happen. So right. Maybe, wishful thinking is it doesn't happen, but, this is what attackers are going to go after.
Wow, fantastic. Great information. So I'm going to switch to Mr. Nagel now. One of the things, and this is actually a question from the audience, so I want to push it to you because one of the things that, you're seeing as workforces become more remote is that your security team, your professionals are also now working remotely. Have you seen a skills gap, or has that been a challenge from a security workforce standpoint for you at Genuine Parts?
We've seen a necessity to work more as one unit across the company, where we in the past, we would put out directives or information and then have the local teams execute. We've seen that it's actually helped in the collaboration for the security team, in the priorities and the resource allocation so that we can prioritize and then we can work as one team. We have seen some areas of skills that we needed to address as it relates to, our virtual desktop infrastructure, because we've moved more into that arena, especially for our third parties that are not using corporate-owned devices. And we've seen that partnership, it was already strong before with our infrastructure team, but we've seen that actually strengthen even more so during this pandemic, where the operations from a cyber perspective, the operations team has worked very well and seamlessly with our infrastructure team. So we've seen us identify additional skills and resources on some of our partner teams, be it infrastructure and applications, to fill those gaps in our skills from a security perspective during this time when we have resources that we need, but we have expertise in other teams that we can leverage.
Okay. Now, one word that you said, resources, that's going to be a challenge. I know a lot of companies, state governments, companies are cutting budgets because of revenue is down, in some cases appreciably, in some cases catastrophically down. So I'm going to ask each of you to just kind of give me your thoughts on kind of how do you adjust to those decreased revenues, and correspondingly, how do you adjust to your decreased budgets and still provide the same level of service, or in some cases, a higher level of service, because now you're dealing with remote workforces, you're dealing with in-office workforces. How do you look to the future and deal with that sort of thing? So I'm going to start with you, John. If you could just let us know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I might take a little bit of a contrary position because we haven't seen a significant decrease in revenue, which is, I guess perhaps as you think about it, not too unsurprising for Verizon, right? As companies are working remotely, they need more bandwidth, they need more security. It's not to say that we're not off in other areas. The consumer wireless business, is down primarily as a result of, things like payment forgiveness and things like that. So we certainly have other areas where we're not faring as well. But on balance, our revenue is held pretty steady. But I will say that this has caused us to really rethink our priorities. Obviously the sort of the broader priorities remain the same. Keep our networks and data and people secure. But as we drill down into what is our new priorities, and where should we be focusing our defenses? What are the increased vulnerabilities that we're facing in this world? We've had to shift. And so one good example of that is we've put together sort of a massive effort around training our employees around about remote working environment, and sort of how they should be thinking about securing their data as they would when they're in the office. We've had increased focus around how do we stand up our retail operations as certain states begin to come online, and that's proving particularly difficult because every state has a different schedule and different mandates. But there are some best practices that we've started to develop in terms of how we're going to open up our retail environment in a new way. How do we take resources that were deployed against areas that were and retail actually comes to mind here. We even though we're opening up, we're not opening up at full capacity, just like restaurants and other businesses are doing. So how do we redeploy our retail staff against other activities? And so what we saw is that our retail staff were very adept at call center customer care. And so as we saw more and more business moving online, we needed more people in our call center to respond to online sales. So we're able to transition some of those retail staff to that. So again, I think it's really where I think every company needs to be thinking about is sort of how are the priorities changed? Where are we going to see increased demand? Where are we going to see decreased demand? How do we think about reallocating and retraining resources? And then from a broader sort of security perspective, how do we ensure the same level of security hygiene in a remote work from home environment that we had when we were all inside the office?
Fantastic. What, Kevin? What about you at Synovus?
Yeah, as John said, priorities are an important piece. Revenue is certainly a challenge for us in an environment of zero interest rates. Not the greatest time in the world to be a bank. But it's causing the business to relook at their priorities. So we're evaluating what do we do, and we're having to go back and relook at our risk appetite. We do a set of things that require resources and investments based on where we set our risk appetite, and we're having to go back and just say, is the environment different? Is it risky or less risky? Just different kind of risk, and revisit our risk appetite, which helps drive some of our investments and our expense. The big piece for us is just continually looking at automation and process efficiencies. How can we get scale? And we're seeing benefit from that, so we can reallocate a scarce resource or potentially reduce some things. And then lastly, we're always asking why. Constant mantra of the team is, why are we doing what we do? If you don't know why you're doing it, that's a really good reason to stop doing it, right? And try to create capacity for ourselves to be able to address the new things or potentially reduce our expense if it comes to that.
David, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. David at Cox.
Ditto what they said. Upskill and automate. Our particular example is we had a crew of about a dozen that's been taking care of network operations and other system operations for years. Guess what? They now do some security ops. They wanted the upskill, and we wanted the automation, little things in automation, like a little extra automated patching. So we will actually do more with what we have through that same old upskill automate, which every technology professional, has managed their entire career by doing.
David, genuine part.
Yeah, the only thing I would say in addition to that is we've looked to, in some areas and as a part of our globalization to outsource more of our back office efforts to help us scale at a less, to optimize our cost.
Fantastic. So now we're getting close to time. Vijay, I haven't forgot about you. I'm going to come to you here in a second, but we're getting close to time and here. And so a couple of things. One is, if you want to download the Verizon data breach report, DBIR, I don't know the exact URL for it, but if you search for it and just search for 2020 Verizon data breach report, it will pop up where you can download it off of Verizon's site. Secondly, we're entering a phase that I call rapid fire. I'm going to ask each of the panelists in 30 seconds to tell us what is the one thing that you should be worried about right now. One thing that they see, a threat that's coming down the road that really is not on everybody's radar, or maybe it is, but the one thing that they are concerned about right now. So Vijay, we're going to start with you. The one thing, 30 seconds, that you're concerned about right now.
So as I mentioned before, I think the one concern that I have is, focus and security for your remote workforce and the notion of an audio breach.
Okay, fantastic. All right, John, Verizon, one thing.
I think we're going to see an increasing. We saw this in the data coming out from last year. It's only going to continue to increase. A focus on theft of user credentials, passwords, user IDs via phishing, and then leveraging those user credentials to access increasingly the SaaS-based applications that everybody is becoming reliant upon. That's only going to increase. Those attacks are only going to get more sophisticated.
Wow. All right. It's getting kind of scary here, gentlemen. All right, Kevin, one thing.
With the changing environment we're dealing with, for me, the top worry is the things I should know about and could know about and don't. Like, you can't protect the assets that you're not visible to or aware of. You can't remediate the vulnerabilities you're not seeing, and you can't mitigate the risks you aren't aware of. So it's making sure that you're retaining a good understanding of what your environment looks like, so you can be taking all the right actions to understand your risk and protect against it.
Fantastic. All right, David, at Genuine Parts, one thing.
Our people. Everybody's dealing with a lot of stress right now. And I think about it all the time, just making sure that they feel supported by the company and making sure that they feel like they can ask the security department questions, personal related or otherwise, just making sure that they feel that support from us.
And you talk about people. It's interesting because I did have a client who actually hired a DJ, large security department. They hired a DJ and had a virtual happy hour just to kind of get the morale up for their people. And so I think you're right. We underestimate the stress that this current situation is causing for our people as they work from home. They're dealing with children. They're dealing with other things, parents. So that's a great point. And so, David at Cox, we're going to close this out with you. If you can tell us one thing that you're seeing out there that we all ought to be concerned about.
Larger scale business outages with all the new folks working in a different place with a different attack surface for us to protect. What could happen if or when internet's just down for a state, a region, a county for a day, 2 days, 3 days? So I'm worried about broader business outages. The good side of COVID is we accelerated making more of our businesses digital. We haven't had time to practice their recovery. So I'm worried about regional localized outages that last for many hours and many days.
Wow. One I hadn't thought about. So John, I'm going to turn it back to you because I know John is going to assure us that those regional outages are not going to occur. It's just not going to happen. So John, close us out here. Again, thank you to Verizon for sponsoring this and for, giving everybody kind of an overview of the 2020 data breach report. John, any last words of assurance for us here that those network outages that David talked about will not happen?
Well, look, I can't speak for our network operations team, but I will tell you those guys are working long hours right now to ensure that that doesn't happen. The good news is, we saw the incredible spike and surge of traffic on our networks, whether it be wireless, wireline, after the COVID crisis. Some really interesting stats where we saw voice traffic, for example, increase as we've never seen it before. It's almost like people were dying for moving from sort of a text-based world as we had been living in to actually talk to somebody on the phone. We've seen those traffic patterns now start to stabilize, and that's you talk to any sort of network engineer, and that's what they look for, right? They want that sort of stabilized traffic so they can make predictions and about where to reinforce the network. So I think we're in a good position. Look, in general, though, just to kind of take a big step back, the whole purpose and point of the data breach investigations for us is to share data. And we think that that is one of the most important things we can do as security practitioners and professionals is to share information. And I would encourage, all of us to share information that helps make our sort of collective defense even stronger. And we do a lot with public sector. We do a lot in the private sector to share that information. And that data is valuable in terms of really prioritizing where companies should harden their defenses. We'll see some changes from as related to COVID, but in general, the attack patterns remain the same. The more you understand those attack patterns, the better you can be at building defenses to safeguard data, information systems, and your employees. So really appreciate the opportunity here to share our findings from the data breach investigation report and participate in this terrific panel, Roy. And as you mentioned, all of this information and more is available to folks online. So we encourage you to access that, access the data breach investigations report. Verizon's always willing to help wherever you need it.
Fantastic. John, Verizon, thank you. Chris, Verizon, thank you. Vijay at Pindrop, thank you. John, Synovus, thank you. Kevin, thank you. I say John, Kevin, getting confused here at Synovus. David at Cox and David at Genuine Parts. Larry, on behalf of Larry and TAG, we thank you for joining us today. We're at the end of the time period, so have a great day and be safe out there. Again, I'm Roy Hadley. Take care.